Hey everyone, this is Dana. Today I'm going to demonstrate for you how to make the diagonal knot stitch. This is a really fun stitch. Allows you to make, I made a big panel here to make a summer weight poncho. I don't know if you can see it there. It's like a mesh fabric. It looks the same on both sides. I've used it to make ponchos with. I've used it as embellishments in scarves. There's all sorts of fun things that you can do with it. I've used it as an embellishment on a hat. You know, you make your brim and then you can throw some rows of the diagonal knot stitch in there. All sorts of fun things you can do with this stitch, and it really isn't that difficult to learn. So let me grab my loom and we'll get started. Alright, I wanted to give you a close-up, a little bit of a close-up of the fabric made by the diagonal knot stitch. Isn't that pretty? This is the right side. This is the wrong side. There is a little bit of a difference, I guess, but still really pretty fabric. I just love it. Alright. The diagonal knot stitch pattern is basically worked over 2 rows. One row is just an E-wrap knit stitch, so that's easy enough. The second row is the row that is all the diagonal knot stitch technique. The diagonal knot stitch, I abbreviate it in all my patterns as DKS. The DKS stitch is worked over 2 pegs. So my patterns will tell you DKS in pairs of 2 usually is how it's written, I think. So you'll know that, okay, I'm going to DKS these 2, the next 2, the next 2. So let me show you what the steps are in the DKS. I'm going to work the DKS over these 2 pegs. Step 1, we're going to take a working yarn, and we're going to put the working yarn behind the first peg to the second peg, and we're going to E-wrap and knit off the second peg. Step 2, we're going to lift the stitch that we've just created off that second peg and bring it back to the first peg. I always kind of snug the yarn up here too. Step 3 is we're going to E-wrap knit the first peg, and we're just taking the bottom loop up off over the top 2 loops. So I'm still going to have 2 stitches on peg number 1. Step 4 is I'm going to lift the top stitch and move it back over to the empty peg, which was peg number 2. And finally, my step number 5, take the working yarn and you come back between the 2 pegs that you just worked and lay it on top of peg number 2. And that's it. So we've just worked the DKS stitch over this pair of pegs. Let's work it over the next pair of pegs. Again, step 1, you take the working yarn, go behind peg 1, and E-wrap and knit off peg 2. Step 2, you lift the stitch from peg 2 and place it back on top of the stitch that's already existing on peg 1. Step 3, I'm going to E-wrap that peg, taking the bottom loop off of the top 2 loops. Step 4, I'm going to take the top loop and move it back over to my empty peg. And the last step is I'm going to take the working yarn and bring it back between my 2 pegs that I've been working the DKS stitch on and lay it in front of the second peg. Alright, let's do it one more time. Here's a pair of pegs that I'm going to do the DKS stitch on. Step 1, the working yarn goes behind peg 1. We're going to E-wrap and knit off peg 2. Step 2, I'm going to take the loop, the stitch that I just created on peg 2, and move it back on top of the loop that's already on peg 1. Step 3, I'm going to E-wrap peg 1. We're going to lift the bottom loop up over the top 2 loops. Step 4, I'm going to take the top loop, the top stitch, and move it back over to my empty peg 2. And finally, the last step 5, bring the working yarn between the 2 pegs I have just been working on and lay it on top of the stitch there. Okay, I have one more pair of pegs to work, so let's do the DKS one more time. Step 1, the working yarn goes behind peg 1 over to peg 2, and we're going to E-wrap and knit off peg 2. Step 2, we're going to take the loop or the stitch that we just created on peg 2, lift it off and put it back on the stitch that existed already on peg 1. Step 3, I'm going to E-wrap peg 1, and we're going to lift the bottom loop, just one loop, up over the top 2 loops. Step 4, I'm going to take the top loop now and move it back over to my empty peg number 2. Step number 5, I'm bringing the working yarn between the 2 pegs I've been working for the DKS stitch and lay it on top of the loop or the stitch that is existing on peg 2, and that's it. This is the last peg in my row, and I know that I'm going to E-wrap it, so I'm just going to go ahead and do that. Alright, so that was my row of DKS stitch. The patterns will tell you then that we're going to skip the first peg and we're just going to E-wrap knit the whole way back. I just wanted to show you the E-wrap knit on the first couple pegs here, just so that you are aware. When you're coming back with the E-wrap knit, you'll see on this peg there are already a couple loops. Both of those loops need to come off and go up over. Okay, so that was E-wrap of that peg. Next peg, we're going to E-wrap it. There's only one loop there, so it comes off. Next peg, there's going to be 2 stitches on that, or 2 strands of yarn. I'm picking both of those up and taking them off. Okay, so when you E-wrap coming back after your DKS, you take all of the yarn that happens to be on the peg off. Alright? And that, my friends, is the hardest part of the DKS stitch. That's it. Again, my patterns will go on to explain to you how to set up your loom, how to cast on, and how to perform each of the stitches. But that is the diagonal knot stitch.